My name is Sophrona Meridian, and I've learned something about family the hard way, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who wound you the deepest. I grew up in Springfield, Missouri, in a house that looked picture-perfect from the outside. The lawn was clipped just right, the shutters painted a calming shade of blue, and the porch always had a fresh pot of flowers. Neighbors waved as they drove by, certain that the Roslyn Rowan household represented small-town values. But inside that house, I was always the one standing in the shadow of my older sister, Valmai. She was the shining jewel, the daughter my parents loved to parade. I was the afterthought, the one who needed to be managed, hidden, or reshaped so I wouldn't distract from the image of perfection they worked so hard to maintain. At 32, I was paying my bills, running my own life, yet every time I stepped into that house, I became that little girl again. The one reminded to tuck her hair just so, to angle her body in family pictures, to keep quiet when Valmai was being praised. It was a quiet evening, 3 months before Valmai's wedding, when I felt the old unease creep back. My mother's voice still rang in my head from earlier that day. She had looked me over, eyes sharp as needles, and remarked, "You know, that birthmark of yours catches the light too much. People can't help but notice it." I had smiled politely, but inside, something cracked. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I accomplished, my entire existence would always be reduced to that mark. I sat in my childhood room, walls stripped of posters long ago, staring at the dresser where my reflection looked back at me in the fading glow of the lamp. I whispered aloud, "In some families, love feels conditional, like you're accepted only if you look perfect." And I knew mine was one of those families. The tension was there, coiled beneath every polished surface of that suburban home, waiting for the next strike. Later that week, it came. My mother found me in the kitchen while my father shuffled papers in the living room. She closed the door, lowering her voice as if this conversation was too shameful to be spoken where others might overhear. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, her gaze fixed on the side of my neck. "Do you know what people see first when they look at you?" she asked, her tone flat but edged like a blade. I steadied myself and shook my head. "What?" "That mark. It's embarrassing, Sophrona. You don't realize how it ruins every photo, family portraits, weddings, even when we go to church. Everyone notices." The words landed heavy. I wanted to scream, to tell her I wasn't a blemish, that she had no right to define me by something I was born with. But instead, I stood there silently, gripping the countertop until my knuckles whitened. In my head, I replayed every time as a child when she had pushed me to the back row of pictures, every Easter Sunday when she had draped a scarf over my shoulder, every sharp look that told me I was not enough. She kept talking, relentless. "You'll have to be careful at Valmai's wedding. This is her moment, and we can't have you drawing the wrong kind of attention." Her words stung worse than any slap. I bit down hard and forced myself not to cry. I remembered something Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." For years, I had given them my consent, standing quietly as they diminished me. But that evening, something inside me shifted. Shame turned into anger, anger into a kind of clarity. I walked out of the kitchen without replying, my silence the only rebellion I had left in that moment. A week later, I tried to bridge the gap, desperate for even a flicker of recognition. I bought a dress for the rehearsal dinner, a soft navy blue that made me feel both confident and understated. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that if I looked just right, they'd finally see me as someone worthy of standing beside my sister. I carried the dress into the living room, where my mother sat flipping through a wedding planner. My father sat across from her, glasses perched low on his nose, pretending to be absorbed in his ledgers. "Mom," I said, holding up the hanger, "I found a dress for the rehearsal. What do you think?" She barely glanced up, her eyes skimming the fabric for all of 2 seconds before her mouth tightened. "That color will only make your birthmark more obvious. You'll make people uncomfortable." "Return it." I stood frozen, the excitement I'd felt drained in an instant. My father cleared his throat but said nothing, just adjusted his glasses and looked away. "Mom," I pushed back gently, "it's just a dress. Why do you care so much?" Her voice sharpened, final and cold. "Because appearances are everything, Sophrona. You may not understand that, but your sister's wedding cannot afford distractions. The word distractions burned in my chest. I wasn't a guest at my own family's celebration. I was a liability. And the very people meant to cherish me were the ones branding me as such. I hung the dress back on the doorframe and swallowed my words, though my silence this time wasn't consent. It was the quiet before a storm. That night, alone in my apartment, I stared at the dress hanging in the corner, caught in the pale streetlight filtering through the blinds. My thoughts swirled. I was in my 30s, independent, managing my life. Yet in their eyes, I was still the little girl who needed to be hidden away, the blemish they had to cover. Valmai was flawless in their gaze, the golden child. She was adored, praised for her career, her beauty, her poise. Every family dinner turned into a tribute to her. In comparison, I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of imperfection. I whispered to myself, a family is supposed to protect you, but mine trained me to hide. The words echoed in the stillness of the room. And then, for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't let myself feel before. Not despair, but defiance. This time, I murmured, eyes locked on that navy dress. I won't stay quiet. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness, but the vow stayed lit inside me. Maybe they thought they could silence me forever, but they were wrong. The living room in my parents' house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old rugs when they called me in. I remember the light filtering through the curtains, the kind that made everything feel too still, as though the room was bracing for what was about to be said. My father sat in his armchair, shuffling papers without really reading them. My mother stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, waiting. I sat down carefully, trying to read their faces. "What's going on?" I asked, already sensing this wasn't just a casual talk. Dimity, my mother, wasted no time. "You're not coming to Valmai's wedding," she said flatly, as though she were announcing a household chore. "We won't let you ruin her day." My chest tightened. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" She didn't flinch. "You heard me. This is Valmai's moment, and we can't risk any distractions." Her eyes drifted to the side of my neck where the birthmark stretched faintly beneath my collar. I turned to my father, hoping for some kind of reprieve. He avoided my gaze, pretending to straighten the papers on his lap. His silence stung worse than her words. "Dad?" I pressed. He only shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "It's for the best." I swallowed hard, my voice trembling but steady enough to push back. "I'm her sister. Don't you think she'd want me there? Don't you think I deserve to be there?" Valmai, who had been standing near the staircase scrolling on her phone, froze. She looked up but didn't say a word. Her eyes flickered with discomfort, but she stayed quiet, slipping her phone into her pocket and glancing at the floor. "Valmai," I tried again, "say something. Do you really not want me there?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She simply gave a small shrug and looked away. That silence cut deeper than anything my mother could have said. It confirmed what I had always feared, that my place in this family was conditional, and even my sister, who I had once defended endlessly, wouldn't stand for me now. "You talk about family unity all the time," I said, my voice tightening. "But it only applies when I'm invisible, doesn't it?" My mother's mouth twitched with irritation. "Stop dramatizing, Sophrona. This is simple. You won't be there. End of story." I stood, my heart pounding. Every nerve screamed at me to shout, to throw something, to make them feel the sharpness of what they had just done. But instead, I walked toward the door. I knew my silence would echo louder than any outburst. Back in my apartment, the words replayed endlessly in my head. "You're not coming." I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the unopened mail scattered in front of me. For hours, I couldn't move past that sentence. I was 32 years old, paying rent, managing my career, living independently. And still, I was being treated like a stain they couldn't scrub out of a family photo. The absurdity of it clawed at me until I felt half sick. I leaned back and whispered into the emptiness. Many American families talk about loyalty, but sometimes loyalty is just silence, and silence kills. I thought of a quote I had read once. "Family isn't always blood. It's who shows up when the world turns against you." That stuck with me. If blood family could exile me so easily, then maybe family wasn't what I had believed it to be all these years. By midnight, I found myself staring out the window at the dim glow of the streetlights. The city outside felt strangely alive, indifferent to my pain, and yet freeing in its indifference. For the first time, I realized I might not need their approval to survive. The bitterness that had eaten away at me began to shift into something sharper, something more solid. The next day, I forced myself to keep moving. Errands had piled up, and I needed groceries. I walked through downtown Springfield, the kind of place where everyone knew your last name, where whispers spread quicker than the morning paper. I ducked into a small cafe to grab a coffee, trying to ground myself. The chatter of the room buzzed like static until I caught my own name. Two women I vaguely recognized, friends of my mother's, were sitting at a nearby table. They leaned close to each other, not realizing I had stepped in line behind them. "Well," one of them whispered, her voice sharp as a pin, "maybe it's for the best she's not going. That birthmark is hard to miss in photos. Can you imagine the pictures?" The other woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I always thought Patricia was so strong, raising two girls, but honestly, one of them's just been a burden." I froze, my coffee order forgotten. My breath caught, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was one thing to be humiliated in my parents' living room. It was another to hear the community parroting their shame as if it were gospel. I wanted to march over, to confront them, to demand they look me in the eye while they repeated those words. But I clenched my jaw and forced myself still. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. They didn't deserve my reaction. I paid for my coffee quietly, head held high, and walked out as though I hadn't heard a thing. But inside, humiliation burned hot, carving itself into determination. That night, I sat by the window again, journal open in my lap. I wrote the words I didn't dare speak aloud in front of them. If they wanted me gone, I'd show them what gone really looks like. The pen scratched furiously against the page. With every word, I felt the sting of rejection turn into fuel. "Sometimes the cruelest rejection is the gift that wakes you up," I wrote. "When people push you out, they free you to walk your own road." I set the journal down and gazed out into the night sky, stars faint against the haze. For years, I had believed that disappearing meant losing. But that evening, I realized disappearing could be reclaiming. My way of saying I would no longer be defined by their lies or their silence. I closed the journal, pressed my palm against the cover, and whispered into the quiet, "They think they erased me. They don't know what's coming." I sat on the couch in my apartment, the journal from the night before still resting on the coffee table, its pages heavy with words I hadn't dared to say aloud. The silence of my place contrasted so sharply with the suffocating weight of my parents' home that sometimes it felt like stepping into another world. Yet even here, in my own space, their words followed me. I reached for the box tucked beneath the coffee table, a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photo albums I had carried with me when I moved out of their house. I flipped one open, the plastic sheets crackling, and was met with smiling faces that should have told stories of belonging. Instead, they reminded me of how carefully I had been pushed aside. I remembered being 8 or 9, standing in the living room while my mother arranged everyone for a family portrait. Valmai stood at the center, her blonde curls perfectly brushed, her dress freshly pressed. I wore my favorite shirt, though the sleeve slipped slightly and revealed part of my birthmark. My mother's face soured immediately. "Smile smaller, Sophrona," she ordered. "Don't show too much." My father added, half distracted but firm, "Just let your sister stand in front. It looks better that way." I remembered the sting of being guided backward until I was half hidden behind my sister. When the photo was developed, the version that hung in the living room frame didn't even include me. They had cropped me out completely. For years, I stood in that house and looked at that picture as though I had never been there at all. Photos are supposed to keep memories alive. Mine were airbrushed out of existence. I can still recall one moment vividly. I was 10, buzzing with excitement because I had chosen a dress with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem. It was the first time I felt like I could stand next to my sister without shrinking. But as soon as my mother saw me, her lips tightened. "That dress shows too much of your mark. Change into something else," I pleaded. "But I like this one. Please, Mom." She didn't bend. Her voice cut sharp. "Do as I said. We're taking pictures, and I won't have you looking careless." I changed. I stood with my arms folded, trying to cover myself while the photographer snapped photos. Later, when the framed picture was unveiled and hung on the wall, I wasn't in it. I had been erased. I asked Valmai, my voice trembling, "Why wasn't I in the picture?" She shrugged, not unkind, but detached, as though repeating what she'd been told. Mom said it looked neater this way. Those words carried more weight than she understood. Neater meant erasing me from my own family. Neater meant deciding I was a blemish on their perfect image. That was the day I realized my parents hadn't been protecting me. They had been managing me like a flaw in the family portrait that needed constant correction. Fast forward to just weeks before the wedding rehearsal. I showed up, trying one more time to stand tall, to show I could exist in their world. I wore neutral colors, hoping not to draw attention. I stood beside Valmai as the photographer called everyone to gather. The photographer squinted through his lens, then said lightly, "Maybe Sofrona can step aside a little. The lighting will be cleaner." The room shifted slightly, people moving into place. My parents didn't object. My sister didn't argue. I stepped back, the sting familiar now, but it still sliced deep. When the rehearsal photos were posted online later that evening, I scrolled through them until my chest grew tight. In the big family shot, I was cropped out completely. At dinner that night, I confronted my sister's fiancé, David, who had been standing nearby during the photo session. "Why didn't anyone say something?" "I was just cut out." He shifted uncomfortably, fiddling with his fork. "Don't take it personal, Sofrona. These pictures are about presentation. You know how it is." "Presentation," I repeated bitterly. That word has become my prison. He offered a half smile, as though that settled it, and returned to his plate. But for me, the word echoed louder than the clinking of silverware, louder than the chatter around the table. It wasn't just childhood memories haunting me. It was happening all over again, in front of grown adults who thought nothing of erasing me. Sitting in my apartment that night, the glow of my phone illuminating the cropped rehearsal picture, I let the weight of it all settle. The ban from the wedding wasn't sudden. It was a sentence handed down years ago. I had simply ignored the verdict until now. I thought about the walls in my parents' home. Every frame was filled with Valmai's smiling face, her graduation cap, her awards, her vacations. Meanwhile, I was absent, not forgotten, but deliberately removed. The worst kind of loneliness, I whispered to myself, is being unseen by those who should know you best. My grief sharpened into something else. Not just sorrow, not just anger, but defiance. I had been erased in albums, cropped from rehearsal shots, silenced in living rooms. But this pattern had also taught me one thing. If they insisted on cutting me out, maybe it was time I did the cutting, on my own terms. I locked my phone, closed my eyes, and breathed deeply. They thought they were preserving perfection by removing me. But soon, they would learn what it meant when the piece they discarded walked away completely. The kitchen smelled faintly of onions from dinner, but all I tasted was the sour edge of betrayal. My parents had just finalized the decision that I was not welcome at the wedding. I stood leaning against the counter, arms crossed, waiting for my sister to walk in. When Valmai finally appeared, she looked as though nothing had happened, phone in hand, scrolling without a care. "Valmai," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, "you heard them. You were standing right there. You could have said something. Why didn't you?" She glanced up for a moment, then back at her screen. With a sigh, she slipped the phone into her pocket and picked at her nails. "I don't want to make things worse." I stared at her, incredulous. "Make things worse? They just banned me from your wedding, our family's biggest event, and you're worried about making things worse?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's complicated, Sofrona. You know how Mom gets. If I argued, it would only cause a bigger scene." My jaw tightened. "A bigger scene? Silence is what makes the scene. Do you even realize what your silence says to me?" She finally looked up, her expression guarded. "You're twisting this. I'm not against you. I just don't want drama before my wedding." I laughed bitterly. "Sometimes betrayal doesn't come with knives, Valmai. It comes with silence when you needed a voice." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't speak. She turned back toward the refrigerator, pretending to be busy with nothing. I wanted to shake her, to force her to see the wound she had opened by doing nothing at all. Instead, I pressed my palm against the counter, steadying myself. The message was clear. In this family, my existence was negotiable, and even my sister wouldn't risk rocking the boat to acknowledge me. The next afternoon, I needed air. needed to be anywhere but my apartment where their words echoed against the walls. I texted Honora Sage, a friend I had known since high school, and we met at a small cafe downtown. It was the kind of place with chipped mugs and booths that squeaked when you slid into them. Normally, that familiarity comforted me. Today, it only amplified the tension in my chest. Honora smiled when I walked in, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I sat down across from her, clutching my coffee cup like it might anchor me. "You know me better than anyone," I said, voice low but steady. "Tell me you'll be there for me. I don't have anyone else left in this." She stirred her drink, eyes darting away. "Sophrona, I care about you. You know I do." She hesitated, her spoon clinking against the ceramic cup. "But Valmai invited me to be part of her bridal party. I can't turn that down." The words sliced. I blinked slowly, setting my cup down. "You're serious?" "It's not personal," she rushed to say, leaning in as if her urgency could soften the blow. "It's just, she has the spotlight. Everyone will be watching. I don't want to lose my place with the family, with the community. You understand, don't you?" I sat back, breath caught between fury and heartbreak. "Understand? You're telling me loyalty is a commodity, and right now hers is worth more than mine." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not about worth, it's about practicality. This is Valmai's moment, and I can't afford to get in the middle." I let out a dry laugh. "First my parents, then my sister, and now you. Betrayal doesn't even feel sharp anymore. It's just a chain reaction." She opened her mouth, then shut it, guilt flickering across her face. But guilt without action is worthless. I stood, dropping a few bills on the table for my coffee. "You made your choice, Honora. Just don't pretend it wasn't one." Her voice followed me out the door, thin and unsure. "I'm sorry." But sorry didn't stitch anything back together. Sorry was the bandage people offered after they'd already let you bleed. The streets of downtown Springfield blurred as I walked, the cool air biting at my cheeks. Cars passed, children's laughter echoed from a playground down the block, but all I felt was the hollow echo inside me. It struck me then how quiet betrayal feels. It doesn't scream, it doesn't slam doors, it just lingers, echoing in every step you take afterward. I remembered a line from John F. Kennedy I once read. "The hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of moral crisis." That was my family. That was my sister. That was my friend. Neutrality had become their weapon. By refusing to stand with me, they had chosen to stand against me. I stopped at the corner, watching the stoplight change. "If they insist on silence," I murmured to myself, "then I'll use silence too, but mine will cut deeper." That thought settled in my chest like a stone, heavy, undeniable, yet grounding. That night, I pulled out my journal again, but my words no longer spilled out like wounds. They sharpened, deliberate and pointed. I can't count on family. I can't count on friends. All I have is myself, and maybe that's enough. I underlined the last 3 words, pressing the pen so hard the page nearly tore. Closing the journal, I leaned back in my chair, the lamp casting shadows across the room. My heart beat steady, no longer frantic with grief but firm with defiance. The next time they dismissed me, I would not shrink. The next time they erased me, I would not let it pass quietly. I whispered into the dim light, "The next time they dismiss me, I'll make sure they remember it." When my mother called to invite me to a family dinner, I knew better than to believe it was about spending time together. She framed it as a chance to talk through the logistics of Valmai's big day, but I sensed it was a performance, another staged event where I would be forced into the role they'd written for me. Still, I went. Part of me wanted to see if maybe there was space left for me at the table, though deep down, I knew better. The dining room was set just as it always had been, polished silverware, glasses sparkling under the chandelier. My mother sat at the head of the table, naturally, directing conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra. My father occupied his usual spot with papers in front of him, a calculator by his elbow, like he couldn't detach himself from ledgers even at dinner. Valmai was radiant, glowing in a way only she could, when every eye in the room bent toward her. I slid into my chair, the empty place setting in front of me feeling like a prop rather than a welcome. The meal began with chatter about the guest list, floral arrangements, and how many hors d'oeuvres were needed for the reception. I tried to contribute, leaning forward saying, maybe for out-of-town guests, we should… But my mother's voice cut over mine before I could finish. Valmai already thought of that. Don't worry yourself. My fork paused halfway to my plate. Even at this table, I wasn't really in the room. I thought to myself, even when I sit here, I feel like a guest in my own family. The conversation rolled on without me. I forced down bites of food, the flavor lost in the thick silence I carried around myself. Halfway through the meal, the phone rang. My father picked it up, muttered a hello, then handed it to my mother. "It's Margaret," he said, referring to an old family friend. My mother pressed the receiver to her ear, smiling brightly, though her words carried clearly into the room. "Oh, Margaret, yes, we're so excited. Everything is coming together beautifully." "Oh, so Frona?" Her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. "She won't be there. She just doesn't fit the picture." The words echoed across the table. I froze, fork clattering against my plate. I couldn't breathe for a moment, the humiliation so sharp it almost burned. When she hung up, I found my voice. "You could have said I was busy, at least. Why humiliate me like that?" My mother didn't flinch. She adjusted her napkin and met my eyes coolly. "The truth is simpler, Sophrona. People already expect perfection. You're the one making it complicated." My father cleared his throat, shifting papers unnecessarily. Valmai kept her eyes on her plate, silent again, her loyalty reserved for the family image. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. In that moment, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was a complication, something to be managed, cut away for the sake of appearances. After dinner, while my mother and Valmai lingered in the kitchen, my father approached me quietly near the hallway. His eyes darted away from mine as he pulled an envelope from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. "Take this," he said, voice low, as though the words themselves were shameful. "Just stay home on the wedding day. It's easier for everyone." I stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of it though I hadn't opened it. "So now my absence has a price tag?" He sighed heavily, shoulders slumping. "Think of it as peace. Not everything has to be a fight." I stepped back, clutching the envelope as if it were something dirty. "Peace isn't bought with silence," I said evenly. "It's stolen with it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He only muttered, "Your mother's just trying to keep things smooth." "You know how she is." I placed the envelope firmly on the counter, refusing to let it linger in my hand another second. "And you know what that makes you? An accomplice." His face twitched, but he didn't respond. He simply walked away, leaving me standing in the quiet hallway, the envelope like a silent insult lying on the counter between us. When I finally stood by the front door, purse slung over my shoulder, I turned back toward the dining room where they still sat, finishing dessert as though nothing had just occurred. "I am not your mistake," I said, voice steady but loud enough to cut through the room. "And one day, everyone will know it." The words landed like stones in still water. My father exhaled heavily. Valmai lowered her eyes to her lap. My mother's expression didn't change at all. Cold, unyielding, convinced she was right. I stepped outside, the evening air hitting me with its sharp coolness. For the first time in years, I felt my anger channel into something more than pain. I wasn't going to keep absorbing their blows. I wasn't going to keep letting silence bury me alive. As I walked to my car, I knew this much. The next time they tried to erase me, they wouldn't find me so easy to dismiss. I glanced back once at the window where their shadows moved behind the curtain. Then I whispered to myself, "They wanted me gone. They'll get their wish, but not in the way they expect." I laid the small jewelry box on my kitchen table, turning it over in my hands like it might suddenly whisper the words I longed to hear. The silver necklace inside glimmered faintly, even in the weak light of my apartment lamp. At its center was a sapphire, deep blue, chosen with care. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a plea, a last chance at recognition. For weeks I had saved for it, forgoing dinners out, telling myself, maybe this will finally make me visible. Maybe if I give her something beautiful, they'll remember I exist. I pictured Valmai opening it, smiling for once at me, instead of past me. I imagined my parents acknowledging the gesture. Older folks always said gifts weren't about the object, but about the heart behind it. And my heart was tired, cracked from years of being dismissed, but still beating, still trying to be heard. I wrapped the box carefully with navy paper and tied it with silver ribbon, the kind of detail my mother would normally praise in anyone else. When I finished, I placed it on the counter and whispered to myself, "This has to count for something." I didn't know it yet, but that necklace would never belong to me. The bridal fitting was held at a boutique with mirrors stretching floor to ceiling. Valmai twirled in her gown, the room filling with the sound of fabric brushing the floor. My mother hovered like a queen, giving orders about hems and lace, her approval shaping the mood of the entire room. When there was a moment, I pulled her aside and pressed the wrapped box into her hands. "Give this to her," I said softly. "It's from me." She nodded without meeting my eyes, slipping it into her bag. I allowed myself a breath, imagining Valmai unwrapping it later. But minutes later, as the boutique filled with chatter, my mother produced the box. She called the seamstress, the photographer, even Valmai's friends to gather. Then, with a smile rehearsed for decades, she announced, "This necklace is a gift from us, to our daughter Valmai." The room erupted in coos and compliments as Valmai gasped, lifting the lid. The sapphire glinted under the lights, catching the eye of every person there. I froze. My throat tightened, words scraping against it, but refusing to come out. "That was from me," I whispered hoarsely, barely audible. My mother's eyes met mine across the room. She tilted her head, lips curving into a cold smile only I could see. "It's better this way. Don't complicate things," she mouthed. The laughter and praise around me blurred. They didn't just take my gift, they took my voice. I turned away, blinking furiously, refusing to let the tears fall here. Fury burned beneath my skin, so hot it steadied me. That evening, I sat on my couch staring at my phone when it buzzed, a text from Valmai. "Sorry about earlier. I didn't want drama at the fitting." I read it again and again, the words twisting inside me. She had known. She had watched them erase me and chosen silence. "Sorry isn't silence," I muttered aloud. "Sorry isn't complicity." I typed a reply. "Do you even realize what you allowed them to do to me?" My thumb hovered over send. Then I deleted it. Silence could be sharper than any reply. I thought of the saying, "An apology without change is just manipulation," and I wasn't falling for it anymore. I set the phone down, a bitter taste in my mouth. The empty gift box still sat on my table, ribbon untied and discarded, like it had never meant a thing. I stared at it long into the night, every line of my face reflected in the window beyond. That necklace was the last straw. For years they had taken little pieces of me, my presence in photos, my place at the table, my dignity in conversations. This time they had stolen something tangible, something I had poured time and love into. And I realized, sometimes you have to let people steal from you once to recognize they've been stealing all along. I pulled out my journal, but my words were no longer pleas for understanding. They were plans, quiet outlines of liberation, not revenge, not yet, but a roadmap to freedom. "They wanted me erased," I whispered, closing the journal, eyes fixed on that empty box. "This time, I'll do it myself." 2 weeks before the wedding, I walked into the church fellowship hall where the congregation was gathering for a midweek potluck. The long tables were covered with casseroles and pies. Kids darted between chairs, and the familiar smell of baked beans filled the air. I carried my head high, though my stomach twisted. I knew whispers would follow me here the same way shadows cling at dusk. As I moved through the room, I caught the sidelong glances. Some people smiled politely, others quickly turned away. I balanced a paper plate in my hand, forcing myself to sit at one of the tables. Across from me, an older woman with kind eyes leaned forward and patted my hand gently. "We're praying for your family during this difficult time," she said, her voice soft, touched with pity. I thanked her with a nod, but inside, dread pooled heavy. That phrase, "praying for your family," meant only one thing. Something had been spread, bigger than rumors, larger than mere whispers. I wasn't just absent from the wedding anymore. I was being cast as a problem to be pitied. The unease grew with every bite I tried to swallow. My fork scraped the plate, and I realized no food could cut through the taste of betrayal. As I cleared my plate, I overheard 2 women behind me, their voices low, but not low enough. Her parents said she refused to come to the wedding, one murmured, as though passing on holy scripture. "Selfish girl." always jealous of her sister. The other clucked her tongue. Imagine abandoning your family at a time like this. My chest tightened. Heat rose in my face. I turned slightly, watching them whisper with satisfaction. Every word was a knife. Later, in the hallway by the coats, a family friend approached me, her expression awkward. "Sophrona, I hate to say this, but your mom told us you abandoned the family during the most important moment." She sounded heartbroken. I swallowed hard. Abandoned? They banned me. My voice was steady, but inside, fury rattled my bones. The friend shifted uncomfortably. "That's not what they're saying." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Of course not. They didn't just silence me. They rewrote me." The friend lowered her gaze, muttered something about having to check on her kids, and slipped away. I stood alone in the hallway, betrayal pressing down until it nearly crushed me. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was recast as the villain. That night, I sat at my desk in the apartment, laptop open. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as I typed. My post was simple, deliberate. I was told not to attend my sister's wedding. That's the truth. I hit publish, my heart racing. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had spoken, like I had carved a space where their lies couldn't reach. But within hours, notifications flooded my phone. My post had been flagged, reported, and then taken down. I stared at the blank screen in disbelief until my phone buzzed with a new message. From my mother. "Stop embarrassing us further. Take it down." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. I typed back, "You already erased me from the wedding. Now you want to erase my words too?" Her reply came quickly. "If you'd loved this family, you'd stay silent." Silent. The word that had haunted me all my life. The command that had chained me since childhood. Silent at the table. Silent in the photos. Silent at the altar of perfection they worshipped. But silence was no longer submission. It was theft. They were stealing my presence, my story, and now even my truth. I closed my laptop, staring at the dark reflection in the screen. "Families like mine don't bury secrets," I whispered to the empty room. "They bury people." The thought chilled me, yet it also sharpened me. I thought of a quote I had once read. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." James A. Garfield had been right. I leaned back, the room thick with shadows, and realized something I hadn't dared admit until now. Silence was both my oppression and my weapon. They wanted me muted, erased, folded into their version of events. But soon, I would wield silence differently, on my own terms. I deleted the half-written reply I had been composing online and whispered into the dim glow of the room. "If they want silence, I'll give them silence. They'll never forget." The barn glowed like a lantern in the dark fields, strung with lights that shimmered against the wooden beams. Music pulsed from inside, muffled by the walls, spilling out each time the doors opened to welcome another guest. Cars lined the gravel drive, laughter drifted into the night, and I stood just beyond the glow, tucked behind a tree as if I were a stranger trespassing on land that once belonged to me. 3 months earlier, I had mapped out centerpieces and catering menus, convinced that maybe this time they'd let me belong. Tonight, I wasn't even invited. I hugged my jacket close and stared at the warm light I'd never step into. My chest ached with a grief I didn't want to admit, mingled with a curiosity I couldn't ignore. From my spot near the side door, I caught fragments of conversations. "She looks like a princess," one woman gushed, likely about Valmai twirling in her gown. Another voice answered, "It's the perfect day. Just perfect." Perfect, I thought bitterly. A perfection bought by my erasure. Through a crack in the side door, I could see the reception. Tables draped in ivory cloth, a cake towering 3 tiers high, and guests clinking glasses in toast. My sister beamed, every inch the bride my parents had always imagined. And then it happened. A guest, clearly drunk, raised his glass too high and slurred loudly enough for half the barn to hear. "Too bad the ugly sister with the birthmark isn't here. Guess the family knew better." Laughter rippled, awkward at first, then growing. My mother, Dimity, didn't defend me. She smiled, waved her hand dismissively and said, "Exactly. Tonight is about perfection." My father chuckled, though it sounded forced, and took another sip of wine. The guests, relieved by their approval, joined in the laughter. I clutched the doorframe so tightly my nails dug into the wood. My absence wasn't just a fact tonight, it was entertainment. Another guest leaned in, voice sharp. Good thing she stayed away. I would have ruined the pictures. And my mother again with that cold assurance. This day is about beauty, no distractions. My stomach churned, rage and devastation colliding until I could hardly breathe. I wasn't just erased. I was mocked into non-existence. I stumbled back from the door, heart racing, when a figure stepped out into the cool night. Ottilie Wren, a woman I knew only loosely from church, approached quietly, her shawl pulled tight. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "I heard what they said," she whispered, pulling out her phone. "You need proof? I've got it." I blinked at her, stunned. "Why would you?" She pressed the phone into my hand. The screen lit with a recording. I heard my mother's voice crystal clear. "Tonight is about perfection. No distractions." The laughter followed, piercing even through the tiny speaker. "You deserve better than silence," Ottilie said firmly. "Keep this. One day you'll need it." My throat tightened. "Why help me?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Because truth matters. And families shouldn't bury their own." For the first time in weeks, my heart pounded not only with pain, but with the thrill of holding something real, something undeniable. This wasn't just my word against theirs. This was evidence. My weapon. I closed my fingers around the phone, my pulse steadying. "Thank you," I whispered, meaning it more deeply than she could know. She nodded once, then slipped back into the barn, swallowed by the music and chatter. I walked away from the glowing lights, gravel crunching under my shoes, Ottilie's recording heavy in my pocket. My car waited at the edge of the lot, dark and silent, like it had been holding its breath for me. Sliding into the driver's seat, I let out a shaky breath and whispered, "Sometimes proof doesn't heal you, it arms you." And tonight, I realized I wasn't powerless anymore. As the barn lights faded in my rearview mirror, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. They wanted me gone. They thought they'd erased me. But now, I had what I needed to write my own ending. If they wanted me gone, I murmured to the empty road ahead, I'd vanish on my terms. The week after the reception was the quietest week of my life. No phone calls, no invitations, not even a text from Valmai. If silence were peace, maybe I could have welcomed it. But this was not peace. It was plotting. The kind of silence that feels like someone is building a case against you while pretending you don't exist. I went about my days in a daze, buying groceries, answering work emails, feeding the neighbor's cat while they were away. But every time I returned to my apartment, the hush inside pressed down on me like a storm cloud waiting to split open. I thought about how silence from my family had always been their weapon. They didn't yell, not often. They excluded, they ignored, they rewrote. And now it seemed they were finalizing the erasure. I sat at my kitchen table one evening and whispered to myself, sometimes silence from a family doesn't mean peace. It means plotting. And I knew, deep in my bones, that something worse was coming. I pulled out an old box from my closet, dusty from years of disuse. It was filled with folders and yellowing papers I had carried with me when I moved out of their house. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd find receipts or notes from when I helped pay for medical bills, or contracts from the catering orders I'd placed in the early planning stages of the wedding. Proof that I had contributed more than they'd ever admit. I spread the papers across the table, sifting through tax forms, utility bills, and medical invoices. Then I froze. At the bottom of the pile was a manila envelope I didn't recognize. My breath caught as I slid the brittle paper free and unfolded the document inside. It was an older version of my parents' will. My eyes raced down the page, tracing every line. There it was, in black and white. I had once been listed as an equal heir, entitled to property, savings, even part of the family business. The date was nearly a decade old. My hands shook. I remembered catching a glimpse of a newer document once, left carelessly on my father's desk. In that one, my name was gone, completely gone, replaced by Valmai's alone. I pressed a hand to my mouth, staring down at the paper. All the comments about my birthmark, all the talk of me ruining the picture, all the dismissals. It hadn't been about embarrassment. It had been about money, legacy, They hadn't banned me from the wedding because I looked wrong. They had banned me because I stood in the way of their perfect transfer of wealth to their golden child. I whispered into the stillness, the words tasting like iron. They didn't ban me from the wedding because of a birthmark. They banned me from the family legacy. The fury hit then, hot and undeniable. My whole life, I had swallowed the lie that my body, my skin, my very face was the reason I was unwanted. But it was never that. It was about inheritance. It was about cutting me out in every sense of the word. I sat at my desk that night with pen in hand and began writing. Not a plea, not a note asking for understanding, but a declaration, a disappearance letter. Each line cut sharper than the last. I wrote that I knew about the will. I wrote that I understood now that the birthmark was never the problem, that they had used my silence to rewrite me, and I was finished giving them that power. I wrote, "If you ever look for me, remember, you erased me long before I walked away." The words flowed steady, deliberate, like I had been holding them inside for years, and now they refused to stop. I wrote that I was no longer their scapegoat. I wrote that I would vanish from their lives, but not as a victim. This time it was by choice. When I finished, I folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, and placed it squarely in the center of my desk. One day, maybe, they'd find it. By then, it wouldn't matter. Near midnight, I packed. Not everything, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my laptop, the recording Audley had given me from the reception. And now, this old will, proof of what they had done. I zipped the suitcase shut, carried it to my car, and placed it in the trunk. The night air was crisp, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Sliding into the driver's seat, I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse steady. The headlights cut through the darkness as I pulled away from the curb. Springfield shrank in my rearview mirror, its lights dimming behind me. As the miles stretched ahead, I thought about something I had whispered only to myself. Sometimes revenge isn't about confrontation. Sometimes it's in your absence. Sometimes revenge is leaving them with the weight of what they've done, with no one left to blame but themselves. I glanced at the passenger seat where the recording and the will rested side by side. I whispered into the dark cabin of my car. This time, I have proof. The community hall smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that never really leaves a place that hosts potlucks and bingo nights. Tonight, it was dressed up for something else. A celebration of Valmai's wedding, a gathering of relatives, church members, and local business partners eager to congratulate my parents on their perfect family. I slipped in quietly, uninvited, my heart pounding but steady. The chatter rose and fell like waves, people praising the decorations at the reception, the grace of the bride, the success of the family. My parents moved through the room like royalty, accepting compliments with practiced smiles. From the back of the hall, I watched. My palms were damp, but my resolve was iron. They built their castle on lies, I murmured under my breath. Tonight, I'll knock one stone loose and watch it crumble. I waited, still as a shadow, until I saw my father lift a glass and my mother stand beside him. The room hushed, anticipation gathering for their toast about family unity. That was my cue. I stepped forward, the scrape of my chair on the floor drawing eyes. My voice cut through the hall before my courage could falter. "Unity?" I said, clear and steady. "You banned me from my sister's wedding, and you told the world I chose to walk away." Gasps rippled. My mother's smile faltered. My father stiffened. Before they could speak, I held up my phone and tapped play. Audley's recording filled the hall. My mother's voice, unmistakable, dripping with disdain. "Tonight is about perfection. No distractions." The drunken laughter followed, shrill and cruel. Silence fell heavier than stone. I lifted the second item from my bag, the old will, its edges frayed but legible. I held it high enough for those in the front to see. "They didn't erase me because of a mark on my skin," I said, my voice breaking, but rising again stronger. "They erased me to steal what was mine." Whispers erupted across the room. "Is that real?" someone muttered. Another voice. "I can't believe this." My parents exchanged desperate glances, but their faces were pale, their practiced composure cracking. Inside, I felt a surge, not revenge, not yet, but vindication. For once, it wasn't just my word against theirs. I had evidence. The room sat in stunned tension until a voice rose from the crowd. It was Ottilie, standing tall, her shawl pulled tight but her voice unwavering. "I was there," she said, projecting across the room. "I heard it with my own ears. This family humiliated her to protect their image." Relief flooded me. Someone was finally speaking on my behalf. Ottilie stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the hall. "Families don't ban their children for birthmarks. They ban them for greed, and everyone deserves to know." The murmur turned into a wave. People shifted in their chairs, some leaning toward me, others glaring at my parents. A cousin whispered, "I always wondered why she wasn't in the photos." An older church member shook his head, muttering, "This is shameful." I looked at Valmai. She sat frozen, her face conflicted, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. For the first time, I saw hesitation in her eyes, doubt creeping in where blind loyalty had once lived. My parents tried to recover. My mother lifted her chin. "She's twisting things." But the crowd no longer looked at her as royalty. They looked at her as a liar. The shift was palpable, like the air itself had turned against them. I didn't stay to savor the collapse. The noise of voices rising, accusations flying, was enough. I turned and walked toward the exit, my shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. Outside, the night was cool and still, the contrast stark against the storm unraveling inside. I breathed deep, not with relief, but with clarity. I spoke softly, not for anyone else but for myself. I didn't need applause. I needed freedom. And freedom isn't given. It's claimed. The old will and the recording had done their work. My parents would face the slow unraveling of their reputation, the whispers that wouldn't fade this time, and I would walk into my future without their chains. As I stepped into the darkness beyond the hall's glow, I whispered one last truth into the night. They thought silence was my cage. Tonight, it became my sword. In the days after the community hall eruption, I settled into a rental apartment in Kansas City, a modest place with creaky floors and sunlight that poured through thin curtains in the morning. I was far from Springfield, far from the house where my voice had been silenced, but close enough that whispers still reached me. Friends called to say the fallout had begun. Business partners stepping back, neighbors muttering disapproval, church members no longer lining up to praise my parents. I felt lighter, not because they had changed, they never would, but because I had stopped carrying the burden of hoping they would. For decades, I had been locked in a waiting room of the soul, desperate for a door to open. Now, I realized the only way to win was not to play their game anymore. I sat at my kitchen table, journal open, and wrote, "Peace isn't something they can give me. It's what I claim when I refuse to be their scapegoat." The pen scratched across the page, steady, my hand no longer trembling. One afternoon, I propped my phone against a mug on the table, angled the light, and took a picture of myself. No scarf, no carefully chosen angle. My birthmark visible, unhidden. For years, that mark had been the excuse for my erasure. Now it was my declaration. I posted the photo with a caption. "For years, I was told to hide this. I'm done hiding. This is me." I set the phone down, heart racing, and waited. Notifications soon flooded in. Messages from strangers, acquaintances, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "Thank you for sharing this," one woman wrote. "My daughter has a similar mark. She needed to see this." Another comment read, "You're beautiful exactly as you are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I scrolled, reading story after story from people who had been told they were too different, too much, or not enough. Their encouragement poured into the cracks my family had left behind, and for the first time, I felt what validation really meant. It didn't come from bloodlines, it came from community, from people willing to see me as whole. I whispered to myself, "They can't erase me anymore. Not here, not now." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I knew my parents would never apologize. The thought used to hollow me out, but now it brought a strange peace. I no longer needed their words. I no longer sat at their locked door, begging for it to open. I can't heal while sitting at a locked door, I told myself. I have to walk away from it entirely. In my journal, I wrote about the roles I had lived under. The golden child who could do no wrong, the scapegoat who absorbed every failure, the silent father who stood by with complicity. Those roles had been the architecture of my childhood, but I had stepped outside the blueprint. A phrase I had once heard came back to me. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I wasn't forgiving them for their sake. I was forgiving for mine, not to excuse their cruelty, but to keep it from curdling my spirit. As I closed the journal, I pressed my palm against the cover. My voice was quiet, but firm. Letting go isn't weakness, it's survival. Later that week, I walked into a community center in Kansas City, invited by a neighbor who mentioned a support group that met on Thursday nights. The room was filled with folding chairs, coffee urns steaming in the back, and people whose faces carried stories like mine, stories of rejection, survival, and slow rebuilding. I listened first, then shared. When I finished, an older man across the circle leaned forward and said, "Sometimes the family we find is more honest than the family we're born into." The words settled deep. I looked around the circle, seeing nods of understanding. These people weren't bound to me by blood, but they offered something my relatives never had: acceptance. Walking home that night, I realized something profound. I was no longer invisible, not to them, not to myself. Back at my apartment, I wrote one last line before bed. My handwriting was steady, each letter deliberate. I let go of them, but I'll never let go of myself again. I closed the journal, blew out the candle on my desk, and let the darkness fill the room, not as an enemy, but as a promise of rest. Weeks passed in Kansas City, but the echoes of Springfield traveled faster than the miles between us. My phone buzzed with updates I hadn't asked for. Friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives who felt compelled to let me know how badly things were unraveling back home. "Your mom canceled 2 of her charity events," one neighbor told me over the phone. "Sponsors backed out after that recording came out. Everyone's talking, so Frona, they can't spin this anymore." I leaned against the counter, listening quietly. For once, the silence wasn't mine, it was theirs. The people who had spent years smothering me into invisibility were finally being buried by their own words. A local newspaper published an article I saw online. "Respected couple faces backlash after recording surfaces." The headline alone was a weight lifted. Underneath were paragraphs about community members questioning my parents' integrity, clients stepping away, church leaders reconsidering their involvement. I closed the screen with a steady hand, a small smile tugging at my lips. They wanted perfection so badly, I whispered into the quiet apartment, that they destroyed themselves with their own lies. The fallout hit harder than even I imagined. Dimity, once the darling of Springfield's charity circuit, was suddenly unwelcome. Her name disappeared from flyers, and her phone calls went unanswered. A friend from town messaged me. She showed up to a luncheon last week, and not a single person sat at her table. My father, Alethea, didn't fare better. His accounting clients began withdrawing. The excuse was always polite. A change in financial direction, simplifying services. But the truth was clear. They no longer trusted him. In small towns, reputation is currency, and theirs had been bankrupted overnight. One evening, I scrolled through an online forum where locals traded news. Comment after comment stung, but not at me, at them. How could parents do this to their own daughter? One post read. Another. All that talk of family values. What a joke. I sat back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't gloating I felt, not exactly. It was justice. A confirmation that I hadn't been crazy all these years. My erasure wasn't love misunderstood. It was cruelty, finally unmasked. Life in Kansas City moved differently. One Saturday, I walked through an art fair in a community park. Booths lined the paths, filled with paintings, pottery, handmade jewelry. I had signed up weeks ago, but nearly backed out. My display was a series of self-portraits, one of which showed my birthmark boldly, without shadow, without disguise. As people stopped by, they lingered at that piece the longest. A young woman approached, her eyes shining. "I used to hide my scar," she said softly. "Seeing you like this, it feels freeing." I smiled, touched by her honesty. Never let them convince you that what makes you different is something to hide. Others shared their stories. A man in his 50s told me about being teased for a limp as a boy. A mother said her child had been told to cover a facial mark. Each voice added to a chorus of shared pain and unexpected strength. Standing there, I felt a shift. What had once been my shame had become my crown. The very thing used against me was now my badge of survival. People weren't laughing. They were nodding, crying, telling me I was brave. And for the first time, I believed them. That night, back in my apartment, I wrote in my journal, "My parents may never apologize, but I no longer need it." I crowned myself with the very thing they tried to erase. I paused, then wrote a line I had once heard. "Our scars remind us where we've been. They don't dictate where we're going." I set the pen down, staring at the words until they blurred. Walking away hadn't been weakness. It had been my strongest act. Refusing to fight on their terms had given me the only victory that mattered: freedom. Later, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. I touched the birthmark on my skin, not with shame, but with reverence. A reminder that I was still here, still whole. The cicadas hummed in the trees. The city buzzed faintly in the distance. I closed my eyes, breathed in the evening air, and whispered into the coming night. I didn't just disappear. I began.